First of all, many thanks for allowing me to do my show. I'm Myles. I'm a historian and philosopher of science and technology, for all of my sins, of which there were many, clearly. I'm also here at Poly. I'm Carl's boss, so I'm in big trouble when it comes to that. I've written extensively I've been a cellist in a previous life, on the interactions among science, technology, particularly physics, music, and instrument making in the 19th century, particularly the 19th century German. And with much trepidation, I'm slowly but surely working my way into the 20th century, which is a very strange world, as many of you know far better than I. And I've been working on recently how certain scientific objects and sounds, which were used as standardizing aesthetics in the 19th century, were used by 20th century composers just to subvert those notions of standardization, of which Philly Xenakis is an example. I've kind of the link with Xenakis. I mean, I've read a ton of stuff with Xenakis from about November until now, and it's an amazingly rich archive for historians of science and technology to delve, which I shall do over the next couple of years, because it really is truly amazing. But kind of the way in which my talk links in with the talk that we just heard is the ways in which musical sounds. Am I too loud or too soft?
No, too soft.
Too soft. I can go up a decibel or two or three. Can you hear me? Touchdown? The record, I mean, do you want me to, I can sing into the mic. I like walking back and forth because moving targets are harder to hit. That's okay, I'll stay close to you, that's fine. And so things such as musical experiments with physical notions, particularly the notion of time that we heard about, the ongoing processes of sound, particularly in the works of Ligeti and Varese, which are rather important to my show today. Also, one thing that's fascinated me, the elimination of the performer stroke virtuoso over the 19th century into the 20th. That's certainly a theme that's critical with the rise of computer music. And also, I don't know if Curtis Rhodes is here yet, but the wonderful work of Curtis Rhodes, who will be talking, I think, on Sunday, if that's correct. Saturday. Sorry, today's Friday. No, today's Thursday. Saturday. That's it, the last day. So those caveats notwithstanding, historians like to read papers, which is aggravating as all heck, I know, but I'll read a bit and hopefully make it up from time to time to keep you amused. But if I go too quickly, since mass and momentum is still mass dependent, just throw something at me and I'll slow down. So my paper analyzes how 19th century acoustical instruments meant to standardize musical aesthetical qualities, such as pitch and beat, were a century later put to use as musical instruments themselves. And metronomes and tuning forks migrated from bourgeois households and rehearsal halls to physics and physiological laboratories, and then back to concert halls, where they were the primary instruments of a number of 20th century compositions. Similarly and famously, sirens, another instrument employed by 19th century acousticians for determining accurately musical pitch, were heard with increasing frequency, pun intended, in 20th century music halls in New York, Berlin, and Paris. I'm particularly interested in how these objects were redefined by their new roles, as the generators rather than the quantifiers of musical qualities, by exploring the use of mechanical apparatus to standardize critical aspects of 19th century music, and the resulting debate surrounding what such standardization meant to the art. Did these machines hinder or enhance expression and creative genius? Could they thwart the attempts of virtuosi to take liberties with the composer's original inventions? 20th century composers such as Ligeti, Varese, and Warren Burt used these same acoustical instruments to subvert the very notions they were created to define and reinforce. What had started as isolated calls for mechanical instruments to count more accurately the beats of a composition culminated in a rather deafening crescendo by the end of the 18th century. The Magdeburg cantor and organist Stöckel, not the metronome but the first name on the list, argued that chronometers were necessary for beginners interested in learning to play music, as well as those amateurs who didn't play professionally, but simply for their enjoyment. In addition, he underscored the importance of the correct standard measure of the time for a composition. The chronometer was, for Stöckel, the ally of the composer, ensuring that the spirit, famous German word Geist, would be preserved, and he hoped that chronometrical markings would ensure a beat based on a universal standard of time, replacing the constant referral to vague terms such as andante, allegro, presto, etc. And the chronometer could provide mechanically what the performer lacked organically. In 1806, the piano instructor Friedrich Gutmann expressed his concerns about using a chronometer as a teaching tool, which students followed throughout the practicing of an entire piece. He said that this was anathema to, quote, the true spirit of real music, unquote. And he added, the greatest artists have also proven that they could not play following such a mechanical instrument. It repulsed their sensitivity and creativity, and they deviated from it involuntarily, unquote. During the early 19th century, not coincidentally, the period that witnessed the increase of individual interpretation, improvisation of the performers, particularly the rise of the virtuosi, one thinks here classically of Paganini and Liszt, gave rise to what some would see as the mechanical tyranny of precision. By the second decade of the 19th century, debates began to rage within German musical circles as to whether or not chronometers or timepieces should be used. Critics noted that mathematical tempo corresponding to chronometer markings might simply be too mechanical. Precision might not be all that beneficial. By not divulging the exact tempo markings for the piece, the composer allowed for individual interpretation. Mechanical control was diametrically opposed to the art of music, a theme echoed by a number of performers of the period. And perhaps the most informed piece on this was one by Gottfried Weber. He was a cellist. He was also a flautist. He was good friends with, unrelated to Karl Maria von Weber, the composer. He founded Cecilia, the important musical journal of the period, and he wrote tons of articles on musical theory, on acoustical theory, on critiques of Mozart's compositions, and on the physiological properties of the human larynx. He was a rather interesting individual. And he set up his essay on the chronometer in the form of a dialogue between a composer and a music director. The composer, of course, is taking the side of the metronome. The music director isn't, arguing that the music director argues that he has the right to interpret the piece the way in which he wants. And there's a wonderful paragraph from the music director, quote, so now you want to invent a new, expensive, mechanical work of art through which an artificial arm shows the choir and orchestra on command all tempi, just as a live musical director is accustomed to do with the baton. Yes, of course, then you'll have a director which surpasses all living directors on rigidity, pedantry, lack of pity, and inability to lend a helping hand, which around the world assists no soloist or covers no mistakes by giving way, and which thrashes out a piece from beginning to end according to rule in an unchanging tempo. That is, we're used to you, well, fine, sir, replace me with the machine and send me off to retirement, unquote. In a sense, the machine would be too perfect for the imperfect art of music and those who performed it. Once the composer assuaged the music director's fear of replacement, he continued the conversation by arguing, no, I never thought it should be there in a performance, only for practicing, somehow invisible. The early chronometers, as ingenious as they might have been, never proved as important as the invention, which was really the pirating, of the metronome by Johannes Nepomuk Merzel. The real inventor was the Dutch mechanician Dietrich Nicolaas Winkel, although Merzel got the patent on it. And his new metronome possessed the critical feature that it was based on the number of beats per minute, a measure of time, unlike the other measure of length, which every country recognized. Chronometers up to that point were based on length. We either had Bavarian inches or Parisian feet. You have later, of course, the meter. Germany had about 27 different forms of measurement in the German territories in 1810. So composers joined the ever-increasing lists of supporters for Merzel's mechanical contraption, including Spontini, Clementi, Viotti, Cherubini, Hummel-Kreutzer, Spohr, and Moscheles. Indeed, an anonymous article in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung said that the metronome would free musicians from, quote, such multi-headed anarchy which rules over these areas, unquote. It was easy to use, it didn't presuppose scientific or mathematical knowledge, and because Merzel was such a brilliant entrepreneur, he gave out 200 away to what he thought were the 200 most important composers of the period. Beethoven was one of the first to use Metzel's metronome markings, and he did his best to enforce his will on performers, as many of you know. Writes to his friend Ignaz von Mosel, quote, "For myself, I, Beethoven, have often thought of giving up these absurd terms, allegro, andante, adagio, presto. Metzel's metronome gives us an excellent opportunity to do so. I give you my word for it here. In my further compositions, I shall not use those terms. That one will cry out, 'Tyrant Beethoven,' I do not doubt, but it still would be better than be accused of feudalism," unquote. Beethoven realized quite critically that this was quintessentially one of control, and he was particularly angered by the virtuosi who constantly took liberties with his tempi of his piano pieces. Being infamously a rather whimsical creature, he withdrew his support for the metronome once he and Metzel became embroiled in a lawsuit over the ownership of the Battle of Vittoria, calling the metronome, quote, "a dumb thing, you must feel the tempo," unquote. And for those of you who are Beethoven fans, second movement of the Eighth Symphony rather famously is a parody of the metronome. This view was the major objection to using the metronome. Rhythm should somehow be organic. One needed to feel it from within, not copy it from mechanical external source. Artificiality, in a sense, has failed genius. That sentiment was echoed by the Romantic critic G.L.P. Sivas, who in September of 1819 argued that the metronome was, quote, "an error of the human spirit, because music cannot be improved by mechanical inventions," unquote. He felt that the performer could use a different tempo, hence the metronome was merely a triviality, and he thought that it was rather strange that Mozart and other renowned composers were content to compose their pieces without referring to chronometers, they're pre-metronome of course, but to chronometer markings. According to Sievers, a philosophical point was at issue. Quote, "A piece of music stops being a product of its composer in the moment when it is performed by an artist. Then this artist is its second creator, or something much more, an animator of the work, transferring his living spirit into the dead form of the composition." In the 20th century, the metronome became a performing instrument to test the boundaries of that well-established classical qualities of rhythm that I just talked about, and the beat. Avant-garde composers toyed with the metaphors of machine, clocks, precision, and standardization. Yegor Ligeti enjoyed challenging well-established boundaries within music. Wishing to remove himself from that classic romantic tradition, the young Ligeti embraced the electronic work of Stockhausen and König, quote, "with regard not only to sonority, but also the form, the unfolding, the flow of music. It was a liberation for me, a liberation from this thinking in bars, this standard measured time," unquote. He developed the musical technique of micropolyphony, which he described as, quote, "the complex polyphony of the individual parts being embedded in a harmonical musical flow, in which the harmonies do not change suddenly, but merge into one another. One clearly discernible interval combination is gradually blurred, and from this cloudiness, think sound cloud, it is possible to discern a new interval combination taking shape before us." Much of the musical compositions dealt with time, its measurement, its precision. He spoke of the spatialization of the flow of time, creating a continuous present, adding, quote, it would be much more worthwhile to try to achieve a compositional design of the process of change over time," unquote. And perhaps the best example of this depiction of precision and the spatialization of the flow of time was his poem Symphonique for 100 metronomes, which he composed in November of 1962. Ligeti himself concedes that the origin of the work dates back to a story with which he had been obsessed as a youth. A widow whose husband had been dead for years lives in a house full of clocks constantly ticking away. The walls are also bedecked with barometers and hydrometers. Quoting Ligeti, "The mechanico type of music really originates from reading that story as a 5-year-old child on a hot summer afternoon," unquote. Continuing the quote, "Nobody comes maybe for 100 years. Nothing happens. So there's a combination of movement which is machine-like and absolutely nothing. A timelessness. No beginning, no end," unquote. The piece debuted at the annual Gaudeamus Music Week in Hilversum City Hall in Holland in September of 1963. Ligeti's piece was an experiment in indeterminate rhythmic counterpoint, furthering his exploration of micropolyphonic textures. It offered the interest of an individual clockwork mechanism, heard together and gradually thinning out over time. And he actually wrote down for us, luckily, the instructions, the way in which this piece was to be performed. pyramid-shaped metronomes. That's not much of a surprise. Usually he recommended 10 players under the leadership of conductor. Each player operates 10 metronomes. It's trickier than it might sound. You can usually do 4 or 6 at one time if you're skilled. I'm not skilled, so I do 2. Metronomes must be brought onto the stage, completely run down. They should be played on resonators. 10 groups of metronomes are to be arranged around a microphone connected to a loudspeaker. Conductor gives a signal, orders the players to wind up the metronomes. Speed of the pendulums are set within each group. Each metronome has a unique speed. Then there are 2 versions that he discussed. Either you have all metronomes wound equally tightly at the beginning, but set on different tempi, or you have several metronomes of a group which are wound unequally. And then the conductor arranges with the players beforehand the method and the degree of winding. The conductor determines the interval of silence between 2 or 6 minutes, if there is silence, or booing, as you'll hear. From the end of the preparation to commencement of performance, another signal from the conductor instructs the performers to set all their metronomes in motion simultaneously. To carry out this action as quickly as possible, it's recommended that several fingers of each hand be used at the same time. With practice, a set of 4 to 6 metronomes can be set into motion simultaneously. That takes a lot of practice. Once the metronomes have been started up, the performers and the conductor must leave the stage as soon as possible. The piece is considered to be over when the last metronome is completely run down. It's up to the conductor to decide the duration of the pause or to run out of the hall as soon as possible. From the moment the last metronome runs down to the moment the performers return to the stage for the applause. If indeed he is lucky. And it turns out there is, I won't play all of it, but there is a YouTube of this, because there's a YouTube of everything. Well, that was well spelled. And I found it. Symphonic.
Poème symphonique a été composé par Xenakis en 1962. Nous
you hear that?
Ce soir. Le concert, que nous sommes allés enregistrer à Rome, est exécuté par un orchestre de centaines d'interprètes. Cette retransmission est une première à la télévision. À l'issue du concert, nous vous apporterons quelques explications, mais d'abord écoutez et regardez. Concert dans 1 minute. Das Konzert beginnt in 1 Minute.
Well, the start is great. They don't have, notice that there are no performers present, because this is a later version, clearly, probably the 1970s. And Ligeti actually recommends that no performers be present afterwards. I'm not going to look at the whole thing, but notice how you have unique rhythms that begin to be heard in the cacophony, right, that then change with time. See how fast this goes. Maybe like a little bit earlier than that. So Ligeti actually talks about the original performance, again, which debuted in Holland in 1963. Quote, following the official speeches, the premiere proceeded according to plan. Since the audience had never heard of Fluxus, And since John Cage, too, was as yet completely unknown to the invited nobility of Hilversum, the last tick of the metronome was followed by an oppressive silence. Then there were menacing cries of protest, unquote. The concert was scheduled to be televised a week later. It was replaced by a local soccer match on the recommendation of the Hilversum City Council. The superposition of pulsation grids, to which Ligeti referred to as the Moiré effect in physics, or an interference pattern created, for example, when two grids are overlaid at an angle, or when they have slightly different mesh sizes, would be used later on in a myriad of his compositions. At the beginning of Poème Symphonique, the grids are so numerous that they coalesce, sounding disorderly and blurred. Ligeti added, quote, "As soon as some of the metronomes have run down, changing rhythmic patterns emerge, depending on the density of the ticking, until at the end there is only one slowly ticking metronome left, whose rhythm is then regular. The homogeneous disorder at the beginning is called maximal entropy in the jargon of information theory and in thermodynamics. The irregular grid structures gradually emerge, and the entropy is reduced, since previously unpredictable ordered patterns grow out of the opening uniformity. When only a single metronome is left ticking in a completely predictable manner, then the entropy is again maximal, or so the theory goes," unquote. As I said, as years went on, he altered the performance of the piece, no longer insisting on the fluxus ceremony. He argued that the metronome should be started before the audience enters the hall so that the piece truly runs like a machine. Metronomes and audience are confronted with each other without any human interaction. And I think that's rather important. Again, no human performer is present. What about pitch? Just as in the late 18th century you had calls for standardization of beats, chaos also reigned in performance pitches as well. Not only did different countries possess different pitches for A, orchestras in the same city or churches in the same city would rarely share the same pitch. In addition to the myriad of concert pitches throughout Europe, there also was a gradual increasing of pitch. Of concert pitch, starting really, most musicologists say, with the Congress of Vienna, after the Congress of Vienna in 1816, and you can actually trace the rise of pitch with tuning forks that we have from the time, well into the mid-1880s. Variation in pitch did not merely alter the aesthetic effect of compositions, it also had an anatomical effect as well. Vocalists in particular were distressed by the lack of pitch standardization. Throughout the first 4 decades of the 19th century, the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung often reported the various diatribes against the rising pitch. Sopranos in particular were fought most ferociously, with prima donnas carrying along a tuning fork to performances, insisting with limited success that the orchestra should tune to them rather than vice versa. In 1814, the philosophers Michelius and Schicht had pleaded for a common pitch for singers and orchestras across Europe. They argued how the necessity of singers to adjust to orchestral pitches, which differed as much as a semitone, was both exhausting and deleterious to their health. Arias requiring the mastery of very high pitches, as well as pieces containing falsettos, were particularly difficult, as singers touring Europe were forced to readjust their ears and vocal cords to the particular pitch that orchestra chose to tune to. The problem became particularly acute by the mid-19th century, when vocalists and instrumental virtuosi touring Europe reached a feverish pitch. The rise in the standardization of pitch determination also comes simultaneous with the rise in the ability to tune keyboard instruments to equal temperament. And that was due much in large part to Johann Heinrich Scheible, who was a silk manufacturer of all things, an opera aficionado in Krefeld, Germany in the 1830s. He had his mechanician, a guy called Kemmerling, build a tonometer consisting of 54 tuning forks, each one 4 vibrations per second, we now say hertz, sharper than the previous one. It comprised a full octave from 220 to 440, and it served as the model for future tonometers such as that Helmholtz uses, built by people like König and Apun. He used his tonometer as an instrument for tuning keyboard instruments, as I said, in equal temperament. He was also renowned among scientific and musical circles for his work on attempting to standardize performance pitch. It was in September of 1834 that he presented his work on the determination for pitch for A to be 440 vibrations per second. After conducting several experiments with various pitches used in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, Scheible decided to choose his A, and this is my favorite story of all time, at 440, as the middle of extremes between which Viennese pianos rise and fell in pitch due to change in temperature on the 12th of November, 1834. So much for the Pythagorean argument of numbers. The pitches of these pianos were determined. He used a monochord. The precise value was approved by the official German pitch, as the official German pitch, by the physics section of all people of the Association of German Investigators of Nature and Physicians in Stuttgart a year later. As you probably do know, it's not, the French then get rather upset, saying they're not going to have 440 as their A. They have the normal diapason at 435, which actually is then incorporated as the official standard in 1885 at an international congress in Vienna. Our pitch of 440 actually comes into use as the German pitch in the 1930s, and yes, there's a very sinister side to that story. Like the metronome, during the second half of the 19th century, the tuning fork migrated from physics labs back to concert halls, this time as a performing instrument rather than a mechanical contraption to assist one's technique in private. From 1985 to 87, the American-born Australian musician Warren Burt composed music for tuning forks. He's best known for composing in a wide variety of new musical styles, ranging from acoustical music, electroacoustic music, sound art installation, and text-based music. He constructed aluminum tuning forks himself for music of tuning forks in the autumn of 1985 when he was an artist in residence at the Australian Commonwealth Scientific and Research Organization's National Measurement Laboratory at Monash University. He tuned his tuning forks, which were both treble and bass forks, to a 19-note just intonation scale, which he derived from Claudius Ptolemy, of all people. And as time went on throughout the 80s and 90s, he decided to increase the intervals of his scale. He created a 53-note scale using computer-generated sounds. So he was able to transpose recorded tuning forks via computer, thereby enabling additional number of pitches that could not be achieved by the limited number of tuning forks he had previously made. In essence, echoing the sentiments of numerous 20th century avant-garde composers, Burt wishes to challenge our equal temperament tuning, in which each semitone is a 12th root of 2 times sharper than the preceding pitch. Since his music for the tuning forks, he's written numerous pieces based on computer-generated music, whereas Scheible had used his tuning forks in the tonometer in 1834 to assist piano tuners to tune in equal temperament, as well as organ tuners. Burt uses tuning forks to explore creatively other possible temperaments. One music critic noted about Burt's music, quote, "Within this microtonal world, sounds combine without losing their identity, individuality, and the music slowly reveals its pitch and rhythm in slow, unhurried, chance-determining clouds of sound. In Warren Burt's hands, these tuning forks become some strange new instrument, complete with its own exotic tuning system," and ... and so on. Similarly, the siren, which unlike either the tuning fork or the metronome had previously been solely an instrument, a physical instrument in physics laboratories, became a performance instrument as well in the 20th century. Indeed, many of you have forgotten more about this than I'll ever know. It's in many more compositions than either the tuning fork or the metronome. The French composer Edgar Varèse employed sirens in a number of his compositions, most notably in Ionization, which debuted in 1931. He was fascinated by the intersection among science, technology, and music. He studied Hermann von Helmholtz's seminal Die Lehre von den Tonempfindungen of 1863 while experimenting with sirens. And in 1913, he had met René Bertrand, inventor of the dynaphone, with whom he would go on to experiment on the possibilities of electronics as a musical medium. 3 years after initially meeting with Bertrand, Varèse argued, quote, "Our musical alphabet must be enriched. We also need new instruments badly. In my own works, I've always felt the need for new mediums of expression, which can lend themselves to every expression of thought and can keep up with thought." Indeed, in 1982, he suggested, quote, "The composer and the electrician will have to labor together to get it right," unquote. In 1927, he collaborated with Harvey Fletcher, who was the acoustical research director of Bell Labs, at the time developing an electronic machine for composing. And from 1932 to 36, Varèse applied annually for the Guggenheim Fellowship to pursue work on an instrument for the production of new sounds. Sadly, the Guggenheim Foundation rejected his application each year. But as a result, he only conducted a number of low-level experiments with phonograph turntables and motors set at different speeds. From 1929 to November of 1931, i.e. when he was working on ionization, Varèse had been contemplating the establishment of a music laboratory for students to compose.
Although the musical laboratory was never created, one can nevertheless see that he was preoccupied with scientific instruments during the period of composing ionization. He was particularly fascinated with the science of sound and tonal color, and relentlessly sought out new musical instruments. Much like Beethoven and others of the early 19th century, who used machines such as the metronome to thwart virtuosi taking unrestrained liberties with the composition, Varèse proclaimed with much bravado, quote, "The performer, the virtuoso, ought no longer to exist. He would be better replaced by a machine, and he will be. We shall find new intensities, too, for the realm of sound has been very incompletely explored. These ideas still shock a great many people, but you will see them become realities in the more or less distant future. The composer will have improved, more flexible means at this disposal with which to express himself. His ideas will no longer be distorted by adaptation or performance, as all those of the classics are," unquote. In 1930, Varèse took part in the discussion on the future of the mechanization of music. His revolutionary views shocked many, echoing the desires of the Italian Luigi Russolo. Varèse went on to express his hope that the new mechanical system would allow new tonal colors, intensities, and frequencies, drawing upon further the work on of acousticians on the limits of human hearing. Ionization was composed for 13 musicians, playing a total of 37 percussion instruments, including 2 sirens, both from the New York Fire Department. The fire sirens, which Varèse also used in subsequent compositions, created a glissando effect through a myriad of frequencies without ever resting on any in particular, thereby using it in a fashion quite contrary to the practice of 19th century physicists. Rather than implementing a siren to provide a steady pitch, as acousticians and physicists had earlier, Varèse stressed the instrument's abilities to elicit numerous tones with various pitches throughout an octave, for example. Sirens in 20th century composition were not meant to increase precision, but to abolish tonal increments in music. It premiered in New York's Carnegie Hall on the 6th of March, 1933, under the direction of Nicholas Solnimsky, to whom the piece was subsequently dedicated. Varèse's concept was that of the, quote, process of atomic charge as electrons are liberated and molecules are ionized, hence the title. He continued, quote, "I was not influenced by composers as much as by the natural objects and the physical phenomena themselves," unquote. So in conclusion, we on time? Touchdown? Woo-hoo. By the 20th century, the metronome and tuning fork were transformed from the visible into the invisible. What do I mean? Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, these physical instruments were seen as mechanical contraptions used to assist the musician and composer by standardizing musical pieces. Recall the debate generated by the music director and composer in Gottfried Weber's essay on the chronometer. Clearly, the metronome and tuning fork were never to be used during a performance. It was the virtuoso who took center stage. Debates arose as to whether mechanical devices deprive the art of music its inherent expression of freedom. During the 20th century, composers decided to draw upon these instruments to explore the notions of precision, whether it be pitch or beat. Whereas Scheibler's tonometer was seen as a device to standardize and thwart the individuality of various temperaments, Bert's tuning forks empowered him to explore forms of creative expression using microtonalities. In a very real sense, avant-garde composers such as Ligeti and Bert provoked their listeners to rethink the very musical notions metronomes and tuning forks had originally been created to reinforce centuries earlier, namely tonality and rhythm. Similarly, the sound generated by sirens in 19th century acoustical workshops and physics laboratories migrated to the concert hall in the United States and Europe. No longer committed to generating a constant pitch, they were now performance instruments used to increase the types of pitches available to imaginative composers. They were employed to thwart the precision of pitch. Varèse wished to stress the range of microtonality that machines could produce. The mechanical now did not merely threaten to quash the creativity of the musician interpreting the piece, it actually replaced the performer altogether in a number of 20th century compositions. Many thanks for your time.